He rescued a golden kitten. A DNA test just revealed the impossible. The morning Gerald Whitmore found the kitten, the temperature had dropped to 19 degrees, and the old man's fingers were too stiff to properly hold his coffee mug. He almost didn't stop. He was 63 years old, a widower for 4 years, and he had learned, the hard way, that stopping for things you weren't prepared for only brought more pain than you could carry. But something made him slow the truck down on that gravel road outside Harlan County, Kentucky. Something made him squint through the frozen windshield at the small shape half buried in a ditch, barely visible against the gray January mud. It wasn't moving. Gerald sat in that truck for 11 seconds. He counted them. Then he opened the door. What he pulled out of that ditch was not what he expected. It wasn't a stray tabby. It wasn't an orange tom or a scrawny black cat the way you usually found them out on rural roads in winter. What Gerald Whitmore held in his cracked, cold hands that morning was something that made him take a full step backward. A kitten so deeply, impossibly golden that his first thought, the one he'd be embarrassed to admit to anyone for months, was that someone had painted it. The fur was thick and tawny, almost amber, catching what little winter light existed and throwing it back like polished metal. The kitten's ears were slightly oversized for its head. Its paws, even at that young age, were enormous. And its eyes, when they finally opened and looked up at Gerald, were not the pale blue of a newborn domestic cat. They were a deep, burning amber, perfectly round, perfectly still. Gerald drove home with the kitten wrapped in his flannel shirt, pressed against his chest. He had no way of knowing that what he was holding would, 14 months later, sit on the desk of a wildlife geneticist at the University of Kentucky, and that the results of a single DNA test would leave an entire team of scientists without a straightforward explanation. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Gerald had lived alone in the same house for 31 years. It was a modest place on the edge of a hollow, surrounded by white oak and hickory, with a back porch that faced a ridge that turned purple every evening at dusk. His wife Connie had loved that porch. After she passed, Gerald had stopped sitting on it entirely. He set the kitten on the kitchen table and looked at it under the yellow light. It looked back at him with those amber eyes, not making a sound. No crying, no panic. Just watching him with a steadiness that Gerald had never seen in a cat, not in 6 decades of living in rural Kentucky, where cats were as common as mud. "You're not right," Gerald said out loud. It wasn't an insult. It was an observation from a man who had spent his whole life working the land and knew better than most what things were supposed to look like. He warmed some milk, added a little water the way he vaguely remembered someone telling him you should for strays, and set it near the kitten. Duke, he named him that within the first hour, not knowing why, just that it fit, lapped at it slowly, deliberately, like he had all the time in the world. Gerald called his neighbor Peggy May Cole the next morning. Peggy May was 68, sharp as a tack, and had more common sense per square inch than anyone Gerald had ever met. She had also, at various points in her life, fostered cats, raised goats, rehabilitated a red-tailed hawk, and once talked a confused black bear off her porch using only a broom and a firm voice. If anyone would know what Gerald was looking at, it was Peggy May. She came over at 8:30 with a pan of cornbread and stood in Gerald's kitchen staring at Duke for a long, quiet moment. "Gerald," she finally said. "Yeah?" "Where exactly did you find this cat?" "Ditch on Route 9, past the old Kimball property." Peggy May set the cornbread down very slowly. "That fur color isn't right for a domestic." "I know." "Those paws aren't right either." "I know." "And those eyes, Peggy May, I know." She picked Duke up. He allowed it, which was notable, because he already had the kind of self-possession that made you feel like you were being granted a privilege rather than picking up a cat. She turned him gently, looked at his ears, his paws, his face. She set him back down. "You need to take him to Dr. Carver. she said, "before you get any more attached." Gerald looked at Duke. Duke looked at Gerald. "Probably right," Gerald said. He waited 3 more weeks before making the appointment. Dr. Linda Carver had been a veterinarian for 22 years. She had a practice in Harlan that served mostly farm animals and household pets. But she had also done consulting work with wildlife rescue organizations and had seen, over the course of her career, things that would surprise most people. She was not easily rattled. When Gerald brought Duke in on a cold February afternoon, Duke was approximately 8 weeks old by Dr. Carver's estimation, though she noted immediately that his development seemed accelerated. His musculature was unusually defined for his age. His paws were, she measured, significantly larger than the standard range for a domestic kitten at that stage. She examined him for 40 minutes. She was quiet for most of it. When she finally sat down across from Gerald, she folded her hands on the desk in a way that Gerald recognized as the gesture people make when they're choosing their words very carefully. "He's healthy," she said. "Remarkably healthy, actually. No parasites, no infections, strong heart, clear lungs." "Good," said Gerald. "But Gerald, I want to ask you something, and I need you to think about it seriously." She paused. "Is there any chance at all, that this animal is not fully domestic?" Gerald blinked. "He's a kitten." "He is," Dr. Carver agreed. "But there are certain physical characteristics here that I can't fully account for with a standard domestic cat profile. The coat density, the paw structure, the cranial shape is slightly broader than I'd expect. And this color." She glanced at Duke, who was sitting on the examination table watching both of them with that unnerving calm. "This particular shade, this density of pigmentation, it's not common in domestic breeds. It's not impossible, but it's not common." "What are you suggesting?" Gerald asked. Dr. Carver was quiet for a moment. "I'm not suggesting anything definitive. I don't have the tools here to tell you more than I already have. But I would strongly recommend a genetic panel. There are labs that can do a full DNA analysis. They can tell you exactly what this animal is, or isn't." Gerald looked at Duke. Duke blinked once, slowly, the way cats do when they're comfortable. The way, Gerald had read somewhere, that cat behaviorists called a slow blink kiss. Gerald drove home without scheduling the DNA test. What happened over the next 12 months is the part of this story that Gerald struggles to describe, even now, because it isn't the kind of thing that translates easily into words. It's the kind of thing that lives in the body, in the particular quality of silence that settles over a house when it is no longer empty. Duke grew, and grew, and grew. By 6 months, he was larger than any domestic cat Gerald had ever seen. Not fat, but long and dense, with a chest that seemed almost barrel-shaped, and a tail that was thick at the base and tapered in a way that Gerald couldn't find a reference for in any cat breed book Peggy May brought over from the library. He did not behave like a house cat. He did not knock things off shelves. He did not hide under beds. He did not yowl at night or scratch the furniture or demand attention in the breathless, urgent way that most cats do. Duke moved through the house slowly and deliberately, like he was always deciding whether the space was worth his time. He claimed the back porch, Connie's porch, as his primary territory, sitting there for hours in the evening, watching the ridge turn purple in the fading light. It was there, on that porch, that Gerald started sitting again for the first time since Connie died. He didn't think too hard about why. He just started doing it. Peggy May came over often. She and Duke had developed a complicated mutual respect. Duke would allow Peggy May to scratch behind his ears for exactly as long as he chose. And then he would stand, walk to the edge of the porch, and sit with his back to her, which Peggy May declared was the most sophisticated social maneuver she had ever witnessed from any species. "Gerald," Peggy May said one evening in October, when Duke had stretched out between them on the porch swing in the cooling air. "You never got that test done." "No." "You planning to?" Gerald looked at Duke. Duke's eyes were half closed, watching something out in the tree line, a movement that neither Gerald nor Peggy May could detect. "I keep thinking about what it might say," Gerald admitted. It was the most honest thing he'd said out loud in a long time. Peggy May was quiet for a moment. "What are you afraid of?" Gerald thought about that. "I'm afraid it'll say something that means I can't keep him." Peggy May nodded slowly. She understood that. She understood the particular terror of loving something you don't feel fully entitled to. "And I'm afraid," Gerald continued more quietly, "that it won't. That it'll just say he's a regular cat, and then I won't have an explanation for any of it." They sat with that for a while. In the tree line, whatever Duke had been watching moved again. His ears rotated forward, tracking it. Then, apparently satisfied, he closed his eyes completely and began to purr. A sound so low and resonant that Gerald felt it in his sternum. It was Peggy May who finally sent the kitten. She ordered it herself, swabbed Duke's cheek one morning while Gerald was out checking the fence line. Duke allowed this with the dignified patience of a man sitting for a portrait, and mailed it before Gerald got back. She told him what she'd done over the phone that evening. Gerald was quiet for a long time. "Results take 3 to 4 weeks, Peggy May said. "Okay," said Gerald. "You're not mad?" "No," Gerald said. And after a pause, "Thank you." The results came in 31 days. Gerald was at Peggy May's kitchen table when they pulled them up on her laptop, because Gerald's internet was unreliable and because he didn't want to be alone when he read them. Dr. Carver had agreed to be there too, which meant something because she hadn't been asked and had offered herself. They read the results together. The first section was straightforward enough. Basic domestic cat markers, mixed heritage, the kind of profile you'd expect from a rural Kentucky stray with a complicated family tree going back generations. But there was a second section, a flagged section, the kind that the lab had highlighted in a separate box with a note attached, explaining that the results had been reviewed by 2 independent analysts before being sent. The 3 of them read it in silence. Then Dr. Carver sat back in her chair and said very quietly, "Well." Peggy May's hand had gone to her mouth. Gerald read the flagged section again, and then a third time. The lab had detected within Duke's genetic profile a sequence of markers that did not correspond to any registered domestic cat breed. That alone was not extraordinary. Mixed breed strays often carried markers outside standard breed profiles. What was extraordinary was where those unidentified markers were clustering. The lab's note explained it carefully, with the measured language of scientists who are aware that their findings sound implausible. The unidentified sequences bore a statistically significant resemblance to markers found in Puma concolor, the mountain lion. Not identical, not a match. The lab was explicit and careful about that. Duke was not a mountain lion. He was not a hybrid in any simple sense. The domestic markers were dominant and clear. But somewhere in Duke's lineage, how far back, the lab could not say with certainty, there was something that defied the standard explanation. Something that had passed down through generations and surfaced improbably in a golden kitten lying in a ditch on Route 9 in Harlan County on a 19-degree January morning. The wildlife geneticist the lab referred them to, a woman named Dr. Patricia Wells at the University of Kentucky, was careful when she spoke to Gerald and Dr. Carver by phone 2 weeks later. She used phrases like statistically anomalous and requires further study and we cannot make definitive claims. She explained that while documented mountain lion hybrids were not part of mainstream scientific consensus for domestic cats, the markers they were seeing were real and measurable and could not simply be dismissed. What this suggests Dr. Wells said, is that somewhere in this animal's ancestry, possibly quite far back, there was a genetic event that we don't have a clean explanation for yet. What we can say is that this animal carries sequences we have not seen in a domestic cat profile before. She paused. He's healthy? She asked. Incredibly, Dr. Carver said. Good, said Dr. Wells, and something in her voice shifted just slightly. The scientist stepping back for a single moment, the human stepping forward. Then whatever he is, he seems to be doing it very well. Gerald drove home from Peggy May's house that evening as the sun was going down behind the ridge. He parked the truck, walked up the porch steps, and found Duke exactly where he usually was, sitting at the far end of the porch, facing the tree line, watching the light die over the hills. Gerald sat down in his chair. Duke did not look at him right away. He kept watching the ridge for another minute or two, with the particular focused patience that had always made Gerald feel, irrationally, that Duke was aware of something just outside the range of human perception. Then the big golden cat turned, walked across the porch with his slow, deliberate stride, and stepped up onto Gerald's lap, which he rarely did. He circled once, settled, and began to purr. Gerald put one hand on Duke's back, felt the warmth of him, felt the low thunder of that purr moving up through his palm. He thought about what the scientist had said. Statistically anomalous. He thought about that January morning on the gravel road, the shape in the ditch, the 11 seconds he'd sat in the truck counting. He thought about Connie and the porch, and the way grief could hollow a house out until it barely felt like shelter anymore. He thought about how a stray cat found in a frozen ditch in the middle of winter could, in the span of 14 months, make a home feel like a home again. Make a porch feel like a place worth sitting. Make an old man who had decided, quietly, without drama, that he was mostly done with being surprised by the world, feel surprised again. He didn't have a word for what Duke was. Not exactly. He had an old word, the one he'd used the first hour standing in his kitchen under the yellow light. The one that had felt right before he had any reason to think it was. Duke. He scratched behind the oversized ears. Duke's purr deepened. Out past the tree line, something moved in the last gray light. A deer, maybe, or a fox, or something that didn't have a name Gerald knew. Duke's ear rotated toward it, tracked it, let it go. The ridge turned purple, then dark. Gerald didn't go inside for a long time. Duke is 2 years old now. He weighs 19 pounds, which 3 different veterinarians have described as remarkable for a cat of his build. His fur remains the same deep amber it was the morning Gerald pulled him from the ditch. It hasn't faded, hasn't darkened, catches light the way it always has. He lives on the back porch in the evenings and indoors the rest of the time. He tolerates Peggy May on his own terms. He has never once knocked anything off a shelf. Dr. Carver still checks on him every 6 months. She has described him, in professional correspondence, as an animal of indeterminate but exceptional genetic heritage. She has also described him, in private conversation, as the most dignified living creature I've examined in 22 years of practice, which she said with complete sincerity and no apparent embarrassment. The wildlife geneticist in Lexington has requested a follow-up sample for further study. Gerald has not yet decided whether to send one. He's in no hurry. There's an old idea, in the mountains of eastern Kentucky, that certain animals come to certain people for reasons that can't be fully explained. That the land sends what's needed in the form available at the moment it's required. Gerald Whitmore was not a superstitious man. He had spent 63 years preferring explanations to mysteries. But on winter evenings, sitting on the back porch with a golden cat of impossible heritage purring in his lap, and the hills going dark around him, Gerald found that he had made a kind of peace with not knowing everything. Some things, he had decided, were allowed to remain exactly what they appeared to be: unexplained, unearned, and exactly right. End.